Why is the left overwhelmingly more sympathetic to Vietnam than it is to China? Want to test it? Go to Twitter and say that China was actually the one who's justified in the Sino-Vietnamese border conflict of 1979. Go on Twitter and try arguing that. Well, Chen Weihua, who the Western left is used to like praising and gassing up, and they love him in every other circumstance, said that, and they all jumped on him, and they said, oh, Chen Weihua, you're so wrong about this. China was in the wrong. So it seems like there's a pretty consistent thread. Vietnam good, China not as good. What the f is going on? Now, when most people hear the word anti-imperialism, what do they think? I think what they're thinking is something like the Ewoks from Star Wars resisting the Empire, and it's Avatar, and then you're got your spears in the jungle, the natives are fighting back. Well, believe it or not, there was actually inspiration for those Ewoks in Star Wars, and it was the Vietnam War. Darth Vader and the Empire, that was Nixon. George Lucas, look it up, he admits it, right? That was literally the inspiration. So something happened in the 60s or the 70s where the hippie movement, regardless of their political affiliation towards communism or socialism even, kind of unanimously started to oppose the Vietnam War because they saw it as this, you know, the man and the military machine is going into the jungles and killing the natives. And the ruling class, artistic, cultural, economic, and political, that would follow in the decades after, were these same people that were in the anti-Vietnam War protest movement. If you didn't know this, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton both have a background in protesting the Vietnam War. And I can name several others. So something weird is clearly going on where it seems like that type of anti-imperialism basically became consensus as far as the political and general establishment is concerned. So how do we make sense of all of those things? Well, the first thing we have to point out and notice is that the Star Wars narrative, or let's just say the Vietnam War paradigm of imperialism, that is dead. That is long been dead. I mean, that much has been clear since the Persian Gulf War of 91. But if you have some kind of idea of some all-encompassing military machine fighting against the natives in the forest and they're invading them for their resources, I mean, there's a reason movies like Avatar are box office hits. They're not substantive critiques of our current status quo. They're critiques of a past status quo that neoliberalism has overthrown. Imperialism, very rarely in the contemporary age, take the form of just invading countries wholesale to take their resources. Now, even the Iraq War, which was waged by George W. Bush, you lib lefties can try to rewrite what happened during the Iraq War. But I remember there's a big distinction between the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. And that distinction was the fact that when it came to the Iraq War, there was a unanimous agreement by both the hippie liberals and the conservatives that Saddam's regime is brutally oppressive against women and the Islamic backward religion. There's too religious, man. Loosen up, man. Have some pot, man. Loosen up. And it's like they combined the hippie sentiment of the counterculture with some kind of militarism. And I remember what the neocons were saying about, oh, we need to spread freedom and democracy. And this was not Cold War rhetoric, because Cold War rhetoric wasn't cultural. When they invaded Vietnam, that was, okay, we need to contain communism structurally, geopolitically. But the Iraq War had a very clear cultural bent that was the inheritance of the new left and the counterculture. Even the Iraq War, in other words, which is like the prime example of US imperialism that's used, did not fall within this hippie new left paradigm of what imperialism is, which was the Vietnam War. Now, I want to be clear. The anti-Vietnam War protesters won. They destroyed the man and the machine. They won. They overthrew that specific version of imperialism, and neoliberalism also overthrew it. Anyone who's positioning themselves as an anti-imperialist, drawing inspiration from the Vietnam War and the anti-Vietnam War movement, those people are not anti-imperialists whatsoever, because those people have been very easily assimilated and integrated into the military state machine. It's literally them in power right now, those same people. And here's my critique of the hippie movement in general. The anti-war sentiment in the 1960s and 1970s wasn't revolutionary. That was sentiment based in the counterculture and cultural morality. It wasn't actually based in the interests of the working class or the proletarian class. In other words, the anti-war and anti-Vietnam War movement in the 60s and the 70s didn't actually base itself in a working class movement based on the material interests of the working class, which is indispensable for creating an actual anti-imperialist movement. It rather based itself on the moral sentiments of a new kind of middle class, professional managerial class in general, as students and so on and so on. It was based in the morality of civil society, or the morality of what Karl Popper called the open society. Now, does that mean I'm against the anti-war sentiment? No, I'm just saying the anti-Vietnam War protest movement was not actually about the Vietnam War at all. It's about an internal shift within the United States where a new class of, you know, kind of middle class, open society class of civil, conscientious, social democracy was asserting itself over industrial machine state, the Fordist state as we know it, that came into existence around the 1920s. So from the 1920s to, let's say, the 50s, America was kind of characterized, or was kind of evolving into, or was taking the form or shape of an industrial Fordist state. So by the time the Vietnam War happens, the widespread anti-war sentiment is not being based in anything relating to the actual war or the material causes of U.S. intervention in that war, which, by the way, was not based in wanting to extract resources. The whole extractivism model of imperialism, ditch it. It's a fucking sham. It's completely unreliable for understanding anything about the world. The key was Bretton Woods, right? The whole thing about containing communism was because communist states were resisting being integrated into the Bretton Woods global economic system, which was a threat to what, in the eyes of the planners of that system, a threat to global economic stability and the maintenance of the global capitalist system. So that's why it actually happened. But the anti-war sentiment was not actually about the war. It was about something going on inside the United States. And those new left people who characterized the protest movement eventually became the people who are in power now. What was the proletarian class position on Vietnam War during that time? Libertarian isolationism, anti-globalism, anti-interventionism. That was a position Marxists during that time never even bothered to develop, because they were dogmatic and stupid, and they were getting too excited about all these dumbass little students with flowers in their ears coming, peace and love, and they thought
Vietnam
that this somehow
War's
represented.
Unpopularity is exaggerated in modern media and American conscience. All contemporary polls show that war approval was always at least 50%.
Yeah, well, that was Nixon's silent majority. And I think the approval for the war was not so much about the war itself as much as it was about this internal counterculture going on in the country between the hippies and this older Fordist boomer working class. Again, the people behind the war had nothing to do with this, right? The war is happening either way because the people who are responsible for this war are these Bretton Woods, you know, planners. But it's almost like the simulation thing Baudrillard was talking about, right? The way in which that the war was presented to Americans, there's a radical discontinuity between the two things, right? The war at home is some cultural shit. The real structural causes and things sustaining that war were totally and entirely different. Now, yeah, and then there's the draft and shit too, but what you're looking at that time is the breakdown of the Fordist state.
So like modern day, where most of Antifa is just white middle class kids trying to spite their parents?
Yeah, exactly. So what am I trying to say with all this? I'm trying to say that something was changing during the Cold War. Something strange was taking shape globally speaking. That movement was within the broader context of the emergence of something different. Now here's what I'm going to theorize what that was. American globalism architecturally was taking shape during the post-war period. Bretton Woods, all these new alliances worldwide, this newfound economic integration, the new role of the City of London Bank. So the change in the cultural superstructure that corresponds to that change was taking the form of the new left and the counterculture. The Beatles and all that shit basically. So it seemed like it was avant-garde and totally revolutionary. It seems like that was taking form as a resistance against all this, when that was actually just the superstructure adjusting to the base. That's what we're dealing with, and that's what was going on during that period. Now, what all that basically means, when you boil it down, is it has not really been analyzed to what extent the synthetic left is not just the synthetic left, but just the left in general in the post-war period, literally just represents the Bretton Woods globalists who wanted to undermine America's sovereign institutions in every respect. And in a lot of ways, the anti-war sentiment was false opposition, because the same forces that seemed like they were behind the counterculture were also behind the Vietnam War itself. So you have this strange circumstance where resistance is the false opposition. The revolutionary hippies are actually the people representing these globalist post-war social engineers and planners who thought that America's... Thank you, Roxoff, so much.
Michael Hudson said that anti-Vietnam War sentiment came from Wall Street because the U.S. was losing its gold deposits to finance the war.
Too. With regard to the Vietnam War and the anti-war sentiment, it really appears one way and the reality is entirely different. And the globalists in the immediate post-war period were seeing America's older Fordist institutions and Fordist culture and Fordist kind of machinery as completely outdated and somehow needing to be circumvented. And once they did that, we had the neoliberalism that happened immediately after. Reagan and all of that. Thatcher. There's a direct pipeline from the New Left to Reagan and Thatcher and these kind of neoconservatives. A direct pipeline.